All right, good evening. I do see that we are running out of chairs, and we're going to fix that problem. We have somebody running down the hallway to grab some more chairs from the room next door. Seems like a lot of excitement around the topic tonight, which is going to be a lot of fun. So thank you for coming out. My name is Jake Byler. I'm your host for the meeting. This is a monthly real estate meeting that is done simply for the purpose of education and connection as investors, as business owners, and all of that. So we cover a pretty broad range of different topics. And tonight, if you are on our email list, you know that we're talking about the pros and cons of using leverage, using debt versus the other side of that, the Robert Kiyosaki versus the Dave Ramsey approach, if you will. Should be a really fun topic. A couple announcements and a couple other things before we get into that. Most of you are aware our meetings are primarily paid for by sponsors, which means you can come for free. Our sponsors for this year are ChatLab with Providence Abstracting Company. Actually, I have a slide here. Why don't I just put them up there? ChatLab, Providence Abstracting Company. Benuel, a realtor. He's one of our speakers for tonight. Jeff Moeller does some private lending. Joe Liofsky, Compass Property Management. And two new sponsors for this year. One of them is Sammy Stoltzfus Mill Run Storage. You'll probably hear more about that at some point. And my friend Sam Glick, Red Box Dumpsters. So I'm actually going to have Sam come up and talk a little bit about what he is offering.
Good evening, everybody. Nice to see so many faces in here. So a little bit about me. So my name is Samuel Glick. I live in Gap and have an exterior company. And in 2020, we're having bad issues with customer service, and that led me into the roll-off business as well. Last year, became a owner of Red Box Plus Dumpsters. And our signature dumpster basically is the one with the porta potties. We have those in the large ones, 30-yarders and the 20-yard. We call them the elites. That's the one with the porta potties. Then we also have the standards as well, 20s and 30-yarders. You guys that are familiar with all that. Obviously, what's the first thing that you need when you buy a property? Most times is a dumpster. So we're the guy that takes care of that. Then we also have these small ones for in the back of the 600s. These are good for like tight areas. So the big trucks, it takes about 80 feet to get that dumpster in there, and then the small truck can get them in about a 40-foot area. Just today we had it. We can't get in there with the big ones. That's what makes it unique about these, being able to offer such a large variety of them. Then, so here's some ways that whether you use us or use another roll-off company is what you can do to help them out, because obviously the more you help them out, the better they can help you out. Overflowing dumpsters. This here goes against all DOT violations. He actually calls for the dumpsters to be filled right to the top, and that is for safety purposes. So when the roll-off company guy shows up and says he can't haul it because it's overflowing, it's probably not because he wants to, but because he has to. Because DOT likes sitting at landfills, and it's like a turkey shoot there. Dumpsters got to go in the landfill at some point. They know where to sit. Something like this, we can tarp that one good. We can take it, nothing sticking out the sides. Then that basically just shows how the tarp goes on there. So just be mindful of that, and be mindful of communication with a roll-off company. They also like the quick turnarounds. They're also in business, just like you guys are. You guys are in business to make money by flipping properties, buying, holding properties. They're in the business making money by providing the roll-off service. All right. So with that, I want to hear some more about that from the real guys.
Thank you, Sam. I am rather disappointed to know that I can't pile another 3 or 4 feet on top of my dumpster. I usually thought we have another 30% to go when we get to the top there, but I don't know. It doesn't seem like that's going to work. All right. Wow. Quick announcement before we dive into the main topic for tonight. I'm not going to spend much time with this, but I do want to let you know that we are planning on running a Saturday workshop for the first time ever, the last Saturday in March. As a board, we have kept talking about catering to beginning investors. This group was originally formed very specifically around new investors and general education, and we have since shifted a little bit away from that. So we're going to do a Saturday workshop geared towards beginning investors. I think it'll be very educational for investors at pretty much any level, but it's going to be geared toward beginning investors. I will be sending out some communication on that, but we're planning for March the 29th, an all-day event at the Eden Resort in Lancaster. It'll probably be $100 to sign up. And just a little fun fact for you, I reserved the rooms there. We're doing lunch, coffee, donuts, pastries in the morning. And just the lunch and the coffee and the pastries takes over half of that, over $50. That's without the room rental and the AV stuff. Part of the reason I tell you that is because that's an obvious sign of inflation, and that's one more reason why I think you should consider investing in real estate. If you're wondering how to sign up for that, I don't know yet. We're just a couple of real estate investors that decided to put on the event. I don't even know how we're going to do that yet, but I will let you know. It'll be local people that have figured out a thing or two about real estate that'll be speaking, and should be a fun day. So we're going to dive into what is a pretty interesting and popular and controversial and sometimes difficult topic about leverage. How much is too much? Like I said, your Robert Kiyosaki versus Dave Ramsey approach. I'm going to run a couple of videos here before we go into. So this is about I think a 50-second video here from Robert that you might enjoy.
In one of your YouTube videos, you actually said that you're currently $600 million in debt.
$2 billion.
1.2 billion. Okay. There we go.
So today I own about 12,000 rental units, but that's not the story. The real story is, how did I acquire those property? I used debt. And that's what they don't teach you in school. The more debt I use, the more property I own, the less tax I pay. And so then these communist school teachers tell you to get out of debt. What's his name? Dave Ramsey and all that, live debt free. And that's good advice for the average person, because debt will kill you. But debt is money today. And so when I acquire an asset, I use debt.
Robert is in Colorado Springs, Colorado. Hey, Robert, welcome to the Dave Ramsey Show.
Hi, Dave. Hope you're having a good day.
I am, sir. How can we help?
I am, let me start by saying I'm a new listener, so I'm not super familiar with the baby steps. But I've been intrigued about the idea of eliminating all debt. But my question was really more revolving around the idea, is there such thing as good debt if the interest rate is low enough? And let's just say, for example, I have enough cash to pay off a substantial amount of debt, but that cash is busy with investments currently. Mm-hmm. Would it be better off to pay off some low-interest debt, or let the money stay with those investments, and they make money in those investments that is greater than the interest rate, I guess is a way to describe it?
It's a great question, and one that a lot of people have asked over the years. I used to kind of subscribe to the same thing because I'm a math nerd, and the idea that if I could borrow, if my mortgage rate is 3% and I can put money in a mutual fund and it makes me 10%, then I made a 7 spread. Why would I not do that all day long?
Sure.
That's the same kind of a thing that you're saying, right?
Correct. Yeah. So, for example, I have a small business in Colorado, and we own a warehouse, and so there's a very big loan against said warehouse. But the interest rate, fortunately, the coronavirus did work out well for this one. It was only 2.5%.
Ta-da! There we go. Okay, now that's exactly what I'm coming to. What I discovered, and you're a new listener, so you don't know the whole stinking story, but I started buying and selling real estate in my 20s. Starting from nothing. Sure. I had $4 million worth. I was a millionaire when I was 26. Then I lost it all because the loans got called by the banks, and my theory of making the spread all went to kaput because I got zero out of it. I ended up bankrupt at 28, and I got the opportunity to start over, which made me question my former theories because my former theory didn't work. What I had left out of my theory, what most people leave out of this theory that you and I are discussing, the 3% versus the 10% mutual fund, the 7% spread appears to be there. What we leave out of that theory is risk.
Sure.
And mathematically, if you install risk into the equation, it starts to dilute or do away with the spread. Yeah. In other types of investments, in sophisticated investment analysis on, for instance, an aggressive growth stock mutual fund compared to a growth and income stock mutual fund, the aggressive is much more volatile, much more risky. The traditional mutual fund, the growth and income, is much less risky, has a lower peaks and valleys if you chart it. You follow me?
Yeah,
so you would never compare a high-risk volatile fund rate of return, apples to apples, with a lower risk, less volatile return. So you might make a 10% on that growth in income. You might make 22 on that aggressive, but you don't compare them the same because we don't compare the roulette wheel with a CD. We adjust for risk. And what happens in what you're discussing is we forget to adjust for risk. So I learned the hard way that risk is real, and people learned it again in 2008, and they learned it again with COVID this year, that risk is real, and that when you have debt, you are susceptible to getting your freaking head taken off.
And well, I agree. My question, I guess, in regard to that.
So I consequently decided to be and live debt-free as the shortest path to becoming and staying wealthy.
Yeah, we can't go, well, that way there is no risk.
Yeah, exactly. Or very little.
Sure.
There's other risks, but it's not the banks. We're not going to get foreclosed on.
Sure.
At all. Now, do I buy fewer things because of that? Yeah, because it takes more money. I don't have I don't own as many buildings. I own a bunch. I own several $100 million worth of real estate nowadays, but I probably could own a couple of billion if I leveraged the same amount of equity into stuff. But then I would be up at night when COVID hits. I'd be up at night when 2008 hits. I'd be up at night when Trump gets crossways with the Chinese. I'd be up at night worrying about how I'm going to make my freaking payments because some tenant didn't make theirs.
Yep.
And so life is too short. The shortest path to peace in my finances, security in my finances, I might be sacrificing some return, but I doubt I really am at the end of the day, because adjusted for risk, I didn't really lose that much. So I live 100% debt-free. So if you're sitting on some investments and you could pay off all your debts, I would pay off your debts. And then I would use the increased cash flow to begin to build some other investments and not have any debt laying around. Because with no payments, you have incredible cash flow.
Just thought it'd be fun to show that before we dive into this. Both of those guys have probably been described as extreme. It seems a little bit unfair to just take one clip of either one of these guys and show that, but it's a challenging topic because there's so many nuances, there's so many variables. And by the way, the two fellows that we have speaking tonight are far from what I would call extreme. By the way, you guys can come on up and then I'll briefly introduce you guys. People can see your faces while I briefly introduce you. Let's give these guys a hand. Dave, this one for now. I'll get you another one shortly. For those of you that don't know, my friend Benuel here on the left. Benuel and I have been friends for quite a number of years. Benuel's been investing for, 7, 8 years, 6 years, 10 years? Quite a journey, has used a lot of leverage, has worked well for him. And like I said, none of these guys are what I would consider to be extreme. I think they're actually both very reasonable in their approach, but I felt like they're two men that would represent well the two extremes, if you will, that we're talking about. Dave Nissley here, don't know him as well. I have been to his property. There's probably a handful of us in here that have done some nighttime trail runs. They've got this beautiful property down in Paradise. Every year, around the first day of summer, he does this run where you can run solo, you can run with teams. Starting at sunset, you start running these trails on his property, 1.5 mile loops, and you run till midnight. I was down there the Saturday evening before Christmas, running with a few people, running through snow, had a massive bonfire going. That was actually when Dave and I talked about some of what we're going to talk about tonight. Really appreciate these guys. We're going to start by having Dave talk a little bit about his journey with running for office last year. He ran for House of Representatives, something that I'm not super familiar with, but he's going to talk about that for a little bit. And then each of them are going to take maybe 10 minutes to talk about a bit of their backstory with investing, or just a bit about themselves and their case for what they believe and why they believe, if you will. And then we're going to just go into, I am depending on some engagement from you guys. I have some questions to get them started. So that's the format for the evening. So we're going to start by having Dave tell us a bit about his experience running for office last year. So take it away, Dave.
All right, thank you. I appreciate that. Thank you, Jake. It's a pleasure to be here, and I tell you guys have privilege. It's a privilege that you have to be here and what these guys put on, so don't take it for granted coming together to learn like this. I'm going to share a little bit of my story. Jake just asked me to do this a few days ago, and I think it is a little bit of a good segue because you wouldn't think it has much to do with investing, but and especially if I'm a no debt guy, you wouldn't think I'm a high risk guy, but running for office is about as high risk as you can get. Because what I didn't know, and it's good that you don't know everything you do ahead of time. Sometimes it's easier just to start and learn what you don't know. But what I didn't know is that it would require 8 months plus of full-time work. And when I say full-time as in starting a new business kind of full-time, way more than 40 hours a week, and a lot of money and a lot of help. And you're doing all of that working up to a day when the vote happens and you either win or you lose. There's no hedging your bets on that one. It's all in to the degree that you can. And that's high risk. We don't invest like that, thank goodness. Because maybe sometimes we do, we throw darts at a wall, but mostly we don't. Most of us are much more calculated. That was a journey, and I want to share just a short picture of that. I didn't anticipate doing that ever in my life. I started listening to Rush Limbaugh 30 years before he died, so in about 1991, I listened to him for 30 years until he died 3 years ago. And he, as well as David Barton from Wall Builders, really helped me understand that what we have in this country as a representative republic, a gift from God, is something that is to be treasured and it's to be kept. And it's a gift that we need to invest in. What I didn't understand is the importance of it being local. I was involved, I loved to watch national politics. I didn't really care about the state, and for sure not really local. What I learned when I ran for office is that the exact same problems that we have at the national level are in the lower levels, all the way down to your local level, because we still have humans. Greed is still a temptation. Power is a temptation. Like, these things are real, just as real here at micro levels as they are at max levels. And so it was, some of the blessings of doing this were the things I learned. Very hard work. I don't want to do it again, but I don't regret a minute of it. I learned so much. We live, and we'll probably talk about this some tonight, we live in these echo chambers that we build unknowingly and somewhat in a good way to protect ourselves, but we hear what we want to hear, whether it's investing or whether it's politics or something in your church or your family. You seek confirmation. Well, doing something brand new or outside of your normal sphere for you to see people and see perspectives and hear others, it forces you to do that. And that was just one of the huge side benefits. So, to just summarize that, it is a blessing that I was able to do that. One of the reasons I was able to do that, to give 8 months of my time and over $40,000 of my own money, is because I was financially independent and able to do that. How you get there tonight is what we'll discuss, but the blessings of being there and the availability it gives you to serve others is the blessing. Not to hoard it, obviously. Nobody here is thinking that. But that's just my testimony of what a blessing it was. And find your way of doing it and start now. Don't wait until you are financially independent or you won't do it. You have to serve and be faithful in small things. So that's just a side story, and I appreciate that. And
You just covered something there that I was actually going to talk about. You said you seek confirmation, or what was that you said? We tend to look for that. And whether you realize it or not, there's probably some of us in the room that were drawn to the topic tonight for that reason, because you have an opinion on something and maybe you came to have that validated. Don't be one of those people, all right? I think all of us up here and most of us in the room would say, like, I don't really care where you land as far as your tolerance to debt, but our goal for tonight here is just to get all of us to see a broader piece of this than what we have before. And when we take a broader look at it, when we can see more, we make better decisions. So Benuel, you can go ahead, tell us a little bit about who you are. I'll get your slides up here for you. And tell us a little bit about your journey and how debt has worked for you and your perspective on that. And don't be afraid to push the edge a little bit, all right? I told you, these guys are not extreme. There will be no shouting matches. There will be no fist fights. These guys are good friends, all right? But like I said, these guys, I feel like they represent well the different angles on it. Benuel, go ahead.
Some of you want a shouting match, huh? Man, it's fun to see the house this full. This is the biggest crew I've seen here. Good to have you here. Dave, one thing you said that I love is if you knew all the things you were going to encounter, you would have probably never done it. I suspect that's true for most worthwhile journeys, right? I can relate to that in my investing journey for sure. It's been incredibly rewarding. I wouldn't trade the experiences for anything now. But 10 years ago, if I would have known everything that we're going to run up against, I don't know. It would have felt different for sure. So for those of you that don't know me, my name's Benuel. I'm a local realtor and investor. I've been doing both for about 10 years. A bunch of clients are in the room tonight, so I appreciate all of you. It's been a great pleasure to do business with a bunch of you. So these days, my time is split between real estate sales and investing. And the investing part is obviously why Jake has me here tonight, so that's largely going to be what I talk about. So it's been such a fun journey, and I'm excited to hear from Dave. This will be a fun evening. It'll be fun to share some of what I get into on that. So I've done a bunch of different things on the investing side. I owned a flipping company for a few years, had a bunch of fun with that, not active in that space today. Sales has obviously been a big thing for a while. I've done some apartment developments, some land deals. In fact, a bunch of land deals, which some of the partners are here right now, and that's pretty cool. Dave, Ernie, it's been a blast working with you guys. My perspective on debt is in a lot of ways shaped by 10 years of positive experiences with that, right? And one of the things that I'm excited to hear from Dave on is he's been through times when debt was a whole lot less favorable than, say, 2015 to today. One of the great things has been a big chunk of that period, you could lock into a 3.5% interest rate, and I got lucky enough to have 10 million plus locked in at around that number. So that may never happen again. So you have to take all of that with, take all of that for what it's worth. I'll point out a bit on my perspective on debt using this chart. This basically represents a chunk of my portfolio. So about 10 million in debt, 10 million in debt, 20 million in assets, ballpark. So I look at this today, and there's basically three ways you can go from here, right? One is the Ramsey method. Pay off everything, in this case, be left with a really solid $10 million portfolio. Some days that looks tempting because, hey, it'd be smaller, it'd be tighter, easier to manage, all of that fun stuff. Another path would be to just let this ride. This is a chart over 20 years. Most of it's on a 20-year amortization schedule, so it'd all be paid off 20 years from now. And if it just increased by 5% a year, which appreciation should take care of almost all of that, that ends up being almost a $50 million portfolio. So that chart is a really cool example of why you should try to build a solid portfolio, whatever it is. Maybe it's the S&P 500, maybe it's real estate, maybe it's something totally different. But it's pretty cool to see what happens with this stuff. Just modest rates of return, just get a chunk build up and just let it do its thing. Can you get me to the next slide, Jake? So this is more aggressive approach. So this would just be 10% annual increase, which that's not going to happen from just appreciation. It's probably not going to even be appreciation in cash flow. This requires some active management, but it's very achievable. I've seen people do way better than this. There's people that'll hit 20%, and then those numbers, those are the guys that become billionaires if you can do that over a long period of time. But that also would, with that chart, so that's, honestly, I did this 6 months ago, and I'm trying to remember the math I used for the debt side of it. But this has growing the debt over time, too, as you acquire more and more. But you'd end up with, in this scenario, just a 10% increases over 20 years. You have a $110 million portfolio and $22 million worth of debt, roughly. So this is, today this would be my preferred approach. Maybe Dave will change my mind this evening. It'll be a fun time of getting into all of that. But this is really the core of what I view as an investor. This is my job. My job is to broaden that gap between what the portfolio is worth and how much I owe on it. That's pretty much it. Obviously, there's a ton of other things that come into play. You've got to make sure it's sustainable. It's got to be managed really well for any of this to work. But at the core of it, that's my job. It's just to widen that gap more and more over time. And I see debt as a great tool to help that happen. curious if Jake or Dave know what happened to Dave Ramsey when he went bankrupt in his 20s. That'd be kind of an interesting play on how does that happen? How do you try to set yourself up where there's no chance of that happening? Obviously, there's never no chance, but stuff can go south without debt too. So you just adjust for that risk. But yeah, that's about what I have to share. So
That's great. I think that's all we need on the slides. I'm actually going to get rid of that, but you can go ahead, Dave.
All right, so I'm going to just introduce a short bio and from where I come from and some of my background. As I grew up in this community, my dad and my mom were both born Amish, and their parents left the Amish. And I bring that up because my dad's family moved from Dover, Delaware to Virginia into a new Amish community that fell apart. My grandfather was a man who was more visionary, wheeler dealer kind of guy, rich and then poor and then rich and then poor. And he was somewhat, had his strange sides too, his unique sides, you might say. And as the family matured, it definitely got worse. And my dad left that home with very little education on money and very little understanding, even at basic levels, of what it takes. Now, my dad was very educated. He was an avid reader, and he learned a lot on his own. Now, compare that to my mom, who came from a Lancaster County family where her father was a steady Eddie. You save everything, very frugal. And he did spend money. He was willing. They went on big vacations, which was unusual at the time, built a new house, which was also unusual. But a very disciplined money manager. So you can imagine in my years, formidable years growing up, I'm old enough to remember the Carter inflation debacle and the 18% interest, and my dad essentially went bankrupt because of that, and a lot of arguments in the house. In fact, it's well documented that most of America's divorces have a direct correlation to finances in the home. Maybe not the cause of it, but it's often a big trigger. And in my home, it was a big argument after we were in bed, of course, and you could hear them discussing this. Now, I don't say any of that to beat up on my parents, but what I am saying that to me, there's a major problem. And so somewhere in my teens, I was introduced to Larry Burkett, and I started reading his stuff and hearing him speak and some of that, and his debt-free living, giving generously, and having peace, financial peace, which sounded great to me. And which ironically, if I'm representing Ramsey tonight, which I'm happy to do, but I've actually not read any of his books until this month. Just don't beat up on me for that. But I do appreciate his principles, and I do adhere to the principles that he advocates for. I have heard him on podcasts and on the radio for many decades already, here and there. So all that to come to today, as a young man then, when I started my first business when we just got married. I had a couple $100, literally bought a couple wheelbarrows and a cheap truck, and I gave all my money to my parents growing up, so I had no money when we got married. And I was told all my life, I was told through those years, it didn't occur to me to go into debt. It just didn't occur to me. It was not my thinking at all. I've never heard of anything like what you're talking about and what you've done in the last 10 years, which is incredible. But that never even crossed my mind. My only option was to work hard and make a profit, reinvest in my business, and grow my business, and which is what I did for 30 years. And during that time, over time, things began to accumulate, and then you're starting to look outside of your business because you no longer, in my case, I didn't have a business that I wanted to scale, so I had to begin investing outside of my business, and which was unfortunate because when I look at my 30-year past history, by far the best investment I've ever made, and probably the best one you'll ever make, is in your own business, because you care the most and you will manage it the best. come around till today where I'll just finish with a couple of things financially. My very first money I borrowed is I bought a piece of land from my dad in about 1996 to put a modular on, and so I owed him money for about a year. And about 6 years later, we bought another property. So then I went to the bank for the first ever, and I borrowed a $120,000 bridge loan that I then paid back in a few months because I had to sell my other property. So at that point, I wasn't being taken to the golf courses with my bankers because I didn't know them. I'd been in business for, at that point, over 10 years, and I didn't then know any banker. They didn't know me either. It's just I used their bank for a checking account, and that was it. I didn't owe them any money. So that was a new experience from me. I'm still friends with that guy, actually, by the way, that gave me that first loan. And then fast forward to today, my brother and I, so in full disclosure, I do have some debt. My brother and I did borrow $1.5 million privately and eventually put it through the bank 6 years ago when we bought the campground because he wasn't able to buy his half, which we have always kept. So just, and again, this is just in full disclosure, I've always viewed that we're liquid enough, we could buy it out, and at 3.6%, we're not going to at this point because inflation is that much. But it does come to term this year, and we do intend to pay it off. But we did need that money because this was an opportunity that we just didn't want to pass up just because of location and opportunity, because we knew the back family of the story and the story. So you could say that I would differ with Ramsey in the sense that maybe there is some good debt. And I think a lot of the discussion tonight, I'm anticipating a lot of questions that people would want us to put a number on the table as to how much debt is too much or how much is a good amount of debt. And that is, if you start from a no debt position, so if you think back on the story I just told you, I came from a no debt mindset and eventually accumulated some debt where a lot of you guys, a lot of people that go to Ramsey or a lot of people even that go to Kiyosaki, you start with a debt mindset and you're changing your minds about a lot of things in that paradigm, but you're actually probably already started with a debt mindset. So it is an interesting perspective I have that I was just fortunate to have and how I grew up. So.
Very good. Okay, I'm going to somewhat join you guys up here. I have a couple questions to get it started, but like I said, I am going to be looking for questions from you guys. These could be hypothetical questions. They could be specific questions that you have. They might not all get specifically answered, but hopefully it'll be some good discussion, right? So start thinking about some questions, all right? The first one that I have for you guys, this is probably something that a lot of us in the room could relate to. If this was never you, it was probably one of your friends or something. But let's just say a young guy wants to get started investing, maybe 20 years old, has, say, $30,000 saved up, has a good job, makes, what, $60,000, $80,000 a year. Okay, so young guy wants to buy his first investment, $30,000 saved up, has a good job. What should he do? You go first, Benuel.
That was basically me 10 years ago, right? And I would probably not recommend doing what I did, actually. That first $30,000 bought the first property, which was then quickly refinanced, and that $30,000 was used to buy the next one, and so on. That's really how the early days went. And the risk back then, as I viewed it, was simply, I'm not going to be able to figure this out, and I'm going to go back to where I was. That's the worst case scenario, probably. And I think that's fair to keep in mind when you're starting out. You try to learn enough that you don't make an outlandish mistake that's going to stick with you for a long time, right? But that's not very difficult to do. I'm pretty sure everyone in here can figure that piece out. And then from there, just do something. I think there's a really good school of thought on, if you're at 30,000, you're making 60 to 80, maybe instead of investing, you think about learning a new skill set, something that can make you maybe a couple hundred before you think about investing too much. I think that's a reasonable school of thought. To me, if you're starting with 30, the only real reason to invest that money is to learn. You're not going to change your life with 30,000. That investment just does, maybe you invest in Bitcoin in 2016 or something like that. But the odds are not good that money's going to change your life. But if you invest it and you start down a path, that path probably will if you stick to it. I think you can really, one of the benefits of being young and having only 30,000 is you don't have a lot to lose. So use that to your advantage. Yeah, so there's a lot more that could be said there, but mostly I want to listen to Jake and Dave tonight, so we'll go with that.
So Dave, how about you? You probably have advised your children in some of these situations. So what's your advice for someone like that?
Yeah, it's a really, it can be tough to give advice in that scenario. So last year when I was in a debate, the Chamber of Commerce held a debate, and I was debating Representative Cutler. And one of the questions that came from the Lancaster Chamber of Commerce was, what is your idea? How are you going to increase revenue to meet the expenses, the budget? And it's my only moment of brilliance, the only thing I remember in the whole debate. But I said, I'm going to reduce my expenses to meet the budget, not increase revenue. And the short and more snarky answer would be to the young man is buy something you can afford. Absolutely invest, but let's figure out what you can afford. And I think that's what I tell my children. And that's been difficult because my children, now they're all of age, and in the last 10 to 15 years, they've watched that Dave, not so much. Now my oldest children remember the Dave that only invested back in his own business. So they watched me and they want to invest like I invest, but they don't have the capital to invest. And so then how do you help? And it was difficult for me too, because I remember one of them wanted to buy a flipper, and I'm like, oh, yeah, I'll be the flipper. You're going to be there to buy it, and I'm going to flip it, and then you're going to be there to sell it. I know how this will go. You want to use my tools, my truck, and my time. Is that right? You can all imagine. But we went. In fact, my son this year, we went to multiple auctions, and we kept losing to the flippers. We went to put some bids on to real estate, and we lost them to the flippers. And finally, I said to him, Josiah, these guys are really good at what they do. They've honed this. They're professionals. If you try to outbid them on this, you're going to learn a lot, but you might not gain much more. Is it really what you want to do this winter? My short advice is find something you can afford. We can discuss what that means, but find something you can afford to do.
And ideally without borrowing money.
I'm not here to tell you. I want you to consider doing things without debt and be creative. Because if your immediate thought is I got to take that $30,000, use it as a 10% down payment on a $300,000 house, then we've got to work on your mindset. There's a lot of things you can do with $30,000. You can even, believe it or not, there's still, you tell me, there's still properties to buy for $100,000. You might have to rethink where you go buy a property. You take that $30,000 and you're putting a 30 or 40% down payment down, or getting creative. Partners, maybe not everybody in this room wants to hear this, but partners are amazing because they can help you in more ways. Now, you might think I'm just sharing my profits with them, but you are, but you're cutting your costs tremendously too, whether it's your capital costs, your labor costs. So be creative with that $30,000. Just don't think that I got to go and leverage this at 10% just as that's what I do.
Sure. So I know one of the things that probably how I started, probably many of us in the room, being that guy with a little bit saved up, you go, if it's today, $30,000 would barely get you a down payment on something in Lancaster City, but it probably would if you find the right property. So say you find something for $125,000, $140,000, something that needs a bit of work, and you get a loan. If it's today, it's probably at 7%, 7.5%, something like that. So let's just say you do that. A common question that comes up for someone that's just starting is then, do you pay it off as fast as you can. You make double, triple payments every month, pay it down as fast as you can because you're paying this high interest of 7%? Or do you put the money back as working towards the down payment for the next property? So we'd just love to hear both of your perspectives on that. You want to go first on that one, Dave?
Sure. So my personal, because, and again, coming from the no debt perspective, the no debt perspective is, it's when you roll it out on paper, yes, your chart's not going to look as great in 10 years as maybe with the leverage perspective. But my challenge to you guys, even if I incrementally move you a little bit, is instead of thinking that max leverage, because what is max leverage? And you touched on, and I'd love to hear more of your thinking on that maybe when you get in a moment. Like you probably wouldn't leverage today like you did on that very first house on your entire portfolio.
Right. No,
right.
No way.
And
no
why
way.
not? Because it doesn't match to you and your debt to value ratio. You wouldn't want it to be because you have a lot more to lose for one thing.
Yeah, that's actually a big part of it. In the beginning, what's the worst case scenario? What are you really going to lose? Right. And now, I think this applies at every level. I was watching this interview with an Indian billionaire the other day, and he made this comment that the way he vets every single deal is he's only going to do it if all he will lose is his investment in that deal. He's never going to make an investment that jeopardizes the rest of his portfolio, right? This is a billionaire talking. This applies for that same $30,000 first chunk that you invest. Like, you want to make sure you limit the downside to the degree that you're not going to lose anything else that you've built up to that point. You don't want to put yourself in a position where you're stuck paying a mortgage for the next 20 years on a worthless property. You limit the downside. And so that's why that's changed for me. Now there's this other piece of the puzzle to protect. Some of them, there's partners in that. Right. Partners' money is sacred. You will not jeopardize that. Yeah, so you grow, you learn. Yeah. Risk tolerance. I would say my risk tolerance hasn't necessarily changed a whole lot other than just being conscious of now there's something there to protect. Yeah. So.
And I think that would be my advice, because if you are a young person, younger, and you have that first, if it is a property and that's your investment, obviously you've got to also, and I think this is a really crucial question, and you've probably answered this question in your mind, but are you intending to have a property management business, or do you have a planning to have a flipping business, or both? And so, because as my son and I were looking at properties, one of the things that we calculated into that is we were not going to bid on a property that we weren't willing to keep for a minimum of 5 years or whatever it would take for to actually turn around and be a profitable investment. And that begins to change your perspective. If it's just about making things happen, you can do a lot of work and not much changes in your portfolio, as most of us, if you've done this for a while, you figure it out. It's very likely.
So back to the question that I asked there, as far as like your perspective on paying something off, paying it down hard versus, yeah, let's hit that for just a little bit. Yeah.
We drifted off pretty far. Yeah.
It was good though. I like these bunny trails. The more the better, in my opinion.
Yeah.
That's good.
So that does look a lot different at 7% than it does at 3% in my world anyway. When we were borrowing money at 3.5%, that was genuinely the time where any deal that worked, I would have just bought for the debt. You don't make stupid mistakes, right? You buy solid deals that cash flow and work well with that. But I feel very differently about debt at 7.5 than I did at those numbers. We're actively working on selling a couple of properties that I would not have dreamed of selling when we could get that at 3%. It's just there's so much equity there. There's other things that I'd like to move that equity to. So the decision is, do I refinance or do I sell? I'm choosing to sell in some scenarios with that level of debt. The answer to that question is obviously it depends on your personal situation. How aggressive do you want to be? At 7, it becomes a lot more tempting to start paying stuff down aggressively than at 3. So.
Yeah, and I think my advice would be to pay down the debt, and that comes from basically personal experience and some of the principles I try to live by. And one of those is, this is an intangible mindset that is difficult. You certainly can't really put it on paper, but I can give you stories that illustrate it when you live this. But when we borrowed that money for the campground, It's the first time I had substantial debt, like legitimate debt. It's hard to believe this. For 25 years, I operated with a mindset of no debt. But with 3.6% interest, almost free money, while inflation is that high and higher, it was really, you wouldn't believe the properties I was looking at to buy. It's like a switch just turned in my mind. And here's another kind of funny story. My brother Philip wanted to farm, and that's pretty unaffordable in Lancaster County. He was looking at poultry farms, and there was a farm eventually that he put a bid on that was over budget. He was only looking at $1 million farms, which would have been he would have had maybe a 40 to 50% down payment. And his poultry operation came up for sale. Great property, just amazing opportunity in the 2 million range. And he didn't get it at real estate. It wasn't an auction, it was a deal, and it didn't go through. And the next week we were sitting there looking through the farming for more opportunities. He said, "It's amazing how much bigger my budget is now. I didn't know I had a $2 million budget." But that's the mindset I'm talking about. You can, if you want to, you can keep buying. But I'm challenging you to consider a mindset that would have much less exposure, and you would make these properties cash flow strongly if you're holding them, and just go slower, because the mindset and the peace of mind that comes from that, your exposure drops tremendously.
Russ, so the question is primarily for Dave about how being through some downturns has shaped how he prefers to operate. And Benuel had touched on this earlier when he opened up about the last 10 years were pretty smooth sailing for investors. How would you answer that, Dave?
It clearly affected me over the years. I have a really good friend who was a builder in the 2008 crisis who, his net worth was Ben's caliber, and he had went all in on a 500-door apartment unit that was going to set him, and his timing just happened to be absolutely horrible. And there's only so it affects me. I watched that, and I watched him struggle out of that, and he's doing okay today, but we're almost 20 years later, and he's doing okay. Yeah, you do see that. And he wasn't doing anything different than the guy down the street or the guy down the street. It just, in his particular case, it was 6 months of timing would have been a completely different story. It's just unfortunate for him. So
Comments from you, Benuel?
Yeah, and so that is possible. I might be tolerant of risk because I have no idea what level of risk I'm taking, right? Now, I do try to model that for everything we do. Obviously didn't experience 2008, but I know a lot of people that have, and I do try to build that into each deal as we go. And it's just basically with the thesis of how can I set this deal up to make sure it doesn't crush the rest of what I have going on, right? So this is a bunny trail too, but so Dave Ramsey talks about his reason for no debt is so he can have peace, right? And I do see that when I look at Ramsey, and I respect that very highly. I think that's something we should all strive for. And peace probably doesn't mean that you just sit back and you live a chill life on a beach. That's not what Ramsey does. Another interesting distinction there is I'm guessing, without taking a deep dive, that Kiyosaki is probably technically worth a lot more than Ramsey is. If he's not, it would just, his real estate portfolio obviously is worth way more. Ramsey's business is quite valuable too, obviously. Telling people to not have debt apparently is a lucrative thing. But it is when I look at the two of them, I've spent time in rooms with Kiyosaki, and while I have massive respect for what he's built, he is an incredibly intelligent man. There are many things about him that I do not want in my life. And Ramsey is actually someone that I look at him and I say, man, he clearly has peace. He has a lot of beautiful things in his life that Kiyosaki doesn't. So it's one of those things. So much of it just comes down to, I think, discovering our own nature and living in a way that's true to that, right? For some of us, that means we want to build fast, we want to build now, and debt's a tool to get that done. That's definitely present in my life. Other people would rather live a more relaxed life, less risk, and that's great. And Then on the topic of risk too, I actually do not feel like I'm really in any kind of risky position today. It might look that way to someone that doesn't understand the business that we've built, but you can mitigate all of that. Great management teams, great principals in the business, great accounting, thanks to John. Yeah, that stuff is all super valuable. And there's probably times when, if John looks at my stuff, that he gets gray hair, because if you don't understand the back end of what goes on and all the levers that can be pulled to liquidate things, it could look risky. But there's so many ways that's another piece of it that you think about. You'll hear the principles of you need to have 6 months of cash in reserve, or a year, or 3 years, or whatever. And those things might all apply. But also, if you're running a sustainable business and you're in a position where you have a lot of social capital, that can be super valuable, where you have people that are happy to write you a check just because of your character and the business you run. There's lots of ways to just mitigate what most people might perceive as risk. So
That's good. Thanks for the question. Anyone else? Over here, Josiah. So the question is, you're acknowledging there's physical implications with debt. What was the second one? Physical and emotional implications, and you're asking about spiritual implications. I'm just trying to repeat the question so everyone can hear and so we understand them.
I'm not sure why I would go first on this one. Yeah, I think there is, and I tread softly here because I understand that probably most or all in this room, we would agree 100% on God is not asking us to be quiet little paupers and just whatever you're given, that's what you should manage. And God does want us to create. He wants us to create wealth. He wants to be creative. Maybe the best comparison I can come up with on the spiritual implications, I would suspect that most of the people in this room, either because you were taught to or you've decided to on your own, keep a Sabbath day tradition of some sort. And you do that because of the principles that God has given you. Now, it's difficult for you to go home to your family and write on a whiteboard all the financial benefits that it gives you and the spiritual benefits, but something's happening that God gave you that principle and he asked you to live that way, and then by you setting aside that day of the week and giving him that first day, that first fruit in honor and gratefulness to him, there is something happening that is difficult to put a finger on, right? I think there's something in the no debt principle, being a slave to the lender. I know that Ben is not a slave to his bank. But there's something going on where you are willingly, in his mind too, the debt I owe, I will do everything possible to pay that back. Even if they call for it unjustly or out of line, which most times they probably can because it's how most notes are written to the bank's advantage. I would, even if I went bankrupt. So there is there's something going on there, and I'm going to let you explore what it is. But I think that there is more there than you can just put on a whiteboard.
Comments from you, Ben?
yeah, this feels like it should be more of a conversation than you lobbing me a question and me trying to come up with it. But we'll go with it. Man. So I think a lot of that, like the spiritual implication, would largely come down to, can you have peace in your life with it, right? And another part of that would be, like, the primary reason I originally set out on the investment path was because I wanted freedom. I didn't want to be stuck at a soul-sucking job for life. I wanted to be able to, I wanted options and freedom, right? If there ever came a time that debt were hindering that, if I felt that the bank was my master, that stuff would get paid off real quick. And I think so much of that comes down to having some awareness of what God wants for your life, having some awareness of what aligns for you, and then following that path, right? And for some of us, that includes some pretty aggressive goals and some things you really want to accomplish. And if that's a tool that serves that and you can do it with peace, you do it, right? But there's so many ways to look at it. One of the interesting bunny trails here is, just so y'all think I'm not just super debt happy, Dave and Ernie and I own a property in Western PA that's probably worth 35, 40 million. We owe $4 million on it. We don't even talk about leveraging against that. Could we each pull a cool couple million from it? Sure. Do we want to? No, not really. I don't push it. Leverage is super powerful. It's awesome. But there's times when there's other ways to build and to grow, and it doesn't always need to be maxed out. It was for me for probably 5 years, and I'm really glad we didn't hit an 08 during that 5-year period. But it doesn't need to be that way for a long time.
It's a great question, Josiah. Anyone else still thinking? All right. I have a quick story that came from someone that's on our email list. When I send out the invitation email, somebody sent me some information of some investments that he had done. And it's a bit vague. I don't have all the details of it, but it validates what can happen with debt when things change, when things are shifting that we didn't think would happen, interest rates going up and so forth. So this individual had made some investments, I think around $7 million, and it was in real estate. It wasn't in crypto or something like that. It was in real estate. So somewhere around 7 million, had borrowed about half of that. So his monthly payments for that debt service was around 18,000. The total income of the investment was around 50,000 monthly. Okay, so you're investing this amount, 7 million, borrowing about half of it. Your payments on that half that you're borrowing, around 18,000 a month. Monthly income of 50,000. That sounds pretty good. You have a lot of room for things to go wrong there, right? Here's where I don't have all the information of what all happened, but with interest rates doubling or more, taxes doubling or more, and insurance doing the same thing on these properties, that 50,000 a month went down to 4,500. And guess what happened to the 18,000 a month debt service? It stayed the same. Now, thankfully, in this situation, there was some margin, there was some other investments, so they'll be fine. But that is how things can turn pretty fast. That's unusual. That's not normal, but it's a real life story. Let's talk a little bit about, I'm sure there's people in the room that probably have this question or have had this question. Again, back to a young person starting out, buying their first property, buying a personal property, renting a personal property versus buying. What if they're renting a personal property and they want to buy real estate and the guy says, I think we should buy an investment property, and maybe they're like, we don't even own our own property where we live. So what are your thoughts on, some people say if you're renting, you're throwing money away. Some people say that can actually work well if you make an investment rather than putting money into a personal residence. So thoughts on that? Do you want to go first, Ben?
Sure, yeah. So if you just do the math on this, you don't consider anything else, it's always going to make the most sense to rent the cheapest thing you can find and invest that money in something that you're really skilled at. There's a little more to any financial decision than just the math. Otherwise, CPAs and accountants would be the wealthiest people in the world. There's a lot to consider there. One of the things is that, so I would be that guy if not for my wife. I'd be living in one of our one-bedroom apartments, probably the cheapest one, and it'd be a great life. We'd be definitely be wealthier than we are today. But there's also the side of there's the principles of, I'm not sure if this is actually even a biblical principle, but the enjoying the fruits of your labors, allowing yourself to be rewarded for work well done, for being inspired by where you spend your time, who you spend it with. Those things are all, they're things that you can't put a price on. And then there's also the other side of it where if we chose to rent at the same level of lifestyle that we live today with the home we bought, we actually would be well behind. Just the simple math is we got so lucky with this, bought our place so cheap. Today it's $1 million+ home that the equivalent of it might rent for $5,000 or $6,000 a month. Just because of dumb luck, we're ahead, and timing being what it is. But yeah, there's a lot of nuance to that question. And renting is not throwing money away. That's the dumbest thing on the planet. It might be for if you're in lower end apartments, maybe for most of those folks. But for those of us that have options, it's a very viable, option. Choose to rent instead of putting a big down payment on something, invest it. Just, know where you want to land lifestyle-wise.
How would you answer that, Dave?
I would answer it similarly. Proverbs says that you should plant your fields first and then build your barn. And my wife didn't like that verse for a lot of years because we were planting a lot of fields in true story, we rented our first house for $350 and a month, and our friends who all got married in that year and the year around us, they were buying houses, and it was difficult to work that through for a while because, and as it turns out, within 10 years, it was obvious what happened. They were still completely and again, you have to remember, we're back a ways, so there was some economic cycles going on. We had friends who 10, 15, 20 years later were completely underwater in their homes, and we're living in a home that we bought with cash, essentially. And and again, yeah, time is helpful. We didn't do that overnight. But back to the question, and the principle is plant your fields, absolutely rent if that's what it takes to plant your fields, and then build your barn, and then your house. Live within your means, like Ben said. It's what your means are different as your means change. Your living will change. Yeah.
Good answer. Questions? There's got to be some. Ben? So Ben is saying it's often said that the first 100,000 in liquid assets is often the hardest to get. And just asking if there's some stories that can relate to that.
Yeah, so that is very true. It's just as true for the first million, first 10 million, whatever it might be. One of the and that is actually, you could pull a good argument for debt out of that, right? You think about the typical real estate portfolio for the last, as long as we know in the US, will appreciate by about 5% a year. There's years where it goes down. There's years like recent ones where we've seen 15, 20% appreciation. But if you take that average on a $2 million portfolio, 5%, 100 grand a year, sounds cool, right? What about a $20 million portfolio? Now it's $1 million a year. That's just happening in the background that you don't even think about. So that's one way that happens, right? One reason to perhaps build more aggressively. But yeah, back to the question on the 100,000, that would be one reason that things get easier as you grow, right? You may start making money in ways that you never dreamed of in the beginning. But I feel like I'm not sure that I'm answering your question as directly as you'd like, so I'll leave that up to Dave.
I'm just going to caution this. I remember being young, married, and in the church, and there was some of the older men in my church who I just thought were wealthy, and I was like, how did they get, how did that happen? After being there with them for 10 years, I realized that they worked hard, and incrementally that wealth grew. And so I agree that 100,000 is one of the most difficult things. And you go back to your question about the $30,000 down payment with a $60,000 to $80,000 salary. Yeah, you could bump that up and increase your net worth by leveraging that and doing that a couple of times over 2 or 3 years. My challenge would be faithful in the small things, grow that. Think about that. From the 30,000 to 100,000 for that individual, it's not that big a leap if you're willing to make that your goal. And now think about your opportunities. They do increase when you have 100,000. It's much easier for me to work with somebody that's got $100,000 to want to start investing than 30, because your opportunities change.
So talking about living within your means, and what about someone that's not living within their means and has 20, 25 large amounts of credit card debt, making $50,000 a year on a job? What's your advice for them? Is that assuming they're asking for advice? Because there's a difference.
I'm going to say, I think Ben and I are both making a huge assumption here, and the assumption is something like this, that you are here because you're investing minded, and you're business minded, and that you have hopefully most of you have had a come to Jesus moment with your personal spending, and you are the kind that might be willing to live in an apartment with Ben to even share that cost. But good. Because if we're going, I'd love to answer personal finance, but we are making a major assumption that your personal finances are not spending that kind of money on credit cards, buying new trucks instead of a used one just because it's easy at the dealership. So if you do, this is a great conversation for you to think about. That is maybe take a step back and look at those personal finances really hard too, because everything that we're saying applies even doubly more to you.
Yeah, that person probably reading a few of Dave Ramsey's book would be a good idea, right? But it's also crazy. In rooms like this, we take for granted that stuff barely happens, right? It's actually 50 to 60% of Americans. It's insane. Maybe not quite that extreme of an example, but pretty close. And one of the interesting things about these whole conversations is I would actually, you can take a stab at guessing at these percentages, right? But I'm going to say probably 95% of America would be better off living by Ramsey standards than Kiyosaki standards. Now, this room is probably an outsized amount of people that are of the 5% that should consider applying some leverage for growth. Yeah, do what you will with that. Yeah. But Ramsey's principles are actually incredibly valuable for most people, including your example for sure.
Yeah, and I don't want to discount that either, because if you do have a legit question in that regard, like maybe you have that personal debt or your son, one of the things that is really helpful because it's overwhelming if that's your state, find your smallest debt, the smallest project, the smallest problem, and tackle it with all your might and get rid of it. And then work on the next, the biggest one, and get rid of that. Okay? Or just spending habits, poor spending habits. Focus on the smallest, easiest. And that's a principle that applies to so much of life. Find ways to be faithful in the smallest, most hidden things. Get them right, and then apply that principle to the bigger scope of your life.
That's great.
Lest you think that's John, it's not. I pay him way more than $50,000 a year.
I think I had seen a hand somewhere towards the back there. Go ahead.
Maybe opening up a new line of thinking here, but I think what I've been hearing, if I'm not mistaken, is it's around risk tolerance and personal peace on the journey. But then you accumulate a portfolio, and I've seen some people at the age where they're liquidating those portfolios and trying to figure out how they're going to leave an inheritance but not cripple their children from gaining the character that they learned on the journey. So we're now talking about achieving and acquiring and growing. Do you guys have a perspective on what's a healthy way to pass that off?
You're way closer to having to think about this than I am. What worked really well for my parents was to throw us to the wolves, right? And, our oldest is 5. We talk about this stuff a lot, considering we're probably at least a dozen years from having to think about it too seriously. But I have never seen a situation where kids were just handed money and done well with it. They probably exist, but I haven't seen them. I've seen a bunch where it did not go well. Yeah, so I think if you can somehow transfer character, principles, and money, that can be an amazing thing. I'd love for our kids to not have to struggle like we did, to start from where we leave off and build from there. And I know it's possible, I'm just not sure how. There's probably a middle ground in there somewhere, right? Throw them to the wolves or give them everything. I'm hoping Dave has the answers for me now.
My maternal grandfather, who was from Lancaster County, who had accumulated some wealth in real estate, and it was quite impressive actually for just his methodical plotting over many years. He did an excellent job of preparing that wealth for his children. Unfortunately, he completely forgot or failed to prepare his children for the wealth. And that's the challenge that you have, and this starts when your children are the age of your children, not when they're 30 or 40 and you're now thinking about giving them an inheritance. This is what happens when they're toddlers and grade school. So prepare your children for that wealth, and wealth not being defined in dollars only, obviously. Wealth by God's standards it's broad. Your children are part of that wealth. And since we are here talking about finances and actual dollars, if sometimes we are so far behind that whether we use leverage or riskier endeavors, whatever we do to speed up the process, it's unfortunate because Scripture talks a lot about leaving for the next generation. And I know my father-in-law was joking. There was a ring of truth to it, but he always jokingly told me that he's planning to time it just right, that he spends everything just before he dies. And we always got good laughs about that. But it's actually not a very funny thing because it happens way too much. In fact, too many people their parents die and they're left with their parents' debt. But think about the ramifications if you break that cycle, and even if you don't reach that big number of 100 million in your lifetime, if it's just 1 million and your children, and you prepared your children for it, and they then take that and they double it and triple it and they double it and triple, like don't think so short as just your fruitful years. Think generational in regards to wealth.
That's great. I see our time is going way too fast tonight, which is what usually happens when we start having fun. Would love to just ask a couple more questions that I think could bring out some good things. You guys have both been in business. Dave, obviously you longer than Ben, but Ben, you've been involved in a lot of different things and with teams and all of that. Just curious if you guys would have a couple just practical business or investing tips for us. Want to go first, Ben?
Let me read my notes on this. Yeah, so the learning to hedge your bets is definitely a key one just from an investment perspective. How can you, any deal that you take on, how can you set yourself up to where it doesn't have a chance at sinking what you've already built, right? I think that's just a good principle for life in general. Another thing that can be pretty transformative is Excel has become my best friend. And that's not literally true, obviously, but it's an incredible tool. So much of the idea of what should we invest in, right? That's a common question. Is this deal better than this deal? What's this deal going to do for me over the next 10, 20 years, whatever it may be? You can model all of that stuff out. And obviously, you're going to make all kinds of assumptions, and what the formulas spit out is only as good as what you put in. But you learn this stuff, and you get good at it. Just as a general business principle, to learn the numbers, learn the way the world works, learn the way you work. And if you can put that all together in a way that, one, you understand, and two, that partners and other people that you're working with can understand, that can become an incredibly powerful thing.
Yeah, so I already gave you one of those, and that is invest in yourself in every way that you can, even if it's diversifying within yourself. So diversification as well. When I thought of what puts us at risk from a wealth perspective, fraud, which is top of mind for a lot of people in the county right now. Fraud's obviously one. Natural disasters, whether it's fire or hurricane, those kinds of things. Personnel, bad management, like that's always some risk there. And lastly, obviously, debt, or when you don't mitigate your risk in that department. So I think what Ben's saying is really good advice. If and when you have debt, make sure that you mitigate the risk on it. Figure out ways to do that. Be creative. Protect your partners by all means. And then another thing that I would say, just from an advice perspective, this little bit of back history. So in the past 10 years, for both tax reasons and time reasons, just restraints on my own time, I have done a lot of primarily passive investing. And that's really difficult because it's completely out of your control, which is the plus side of it, but it's also the really negative side of it, which, again, in full disclosure, some of those passive investments were in syndications that do leverage. Ironically, a lot of those didn't turn out real well because of debt, interest rates going up, flood insurance going up, taxes going up, things that weren't formulated. And now I have no control because I'm a minority partner. And that would be a piece of advice. It ties into that piece of, so there's a Proverbs that talks about knowing your flocks and your herds. And I think that would be the advice I give, is whatever you decide to do and how you invest, make sure you know what you're doing to the best of your ability. If it requires one extra trip with Ben to go look at that property again, or don't rely just on the title insurance search or whatever. Do your homework to the best. Know what you're dealing with. Be 100% on these things. It's nobody but you that ultimately cares. The bank doesn't. They're doing their work, and they have done their risk analysis. They know how they're getting that money when it fails. You're the one that matters. to do that. So that would be my piece of advice. Be diligent in that.
That's good. I know you have quite a bit of notes there, Dave, and even more important than that, you have just a lot of years of experience and wisdom. Do you have any other stories or things you want to share before we wrap up? If you don't, it's fine, but I just want to give you the opportunity.
Sorry, I wasn't looking. I did have a page here where I had some things written for closing. So I'll just say this. I'll say two things here. This is a quote that's not mine. You've probably heard it, and that is, gold is the money of kings, silver is the money of gentlemen, barter is the money of peasants, and debt is the money of slaves. And there's a little bit of truth to that. It's funny because it's a little bit true. I won't say more. So here's the thing. Here's how I'll leave it. And then Ben gets the last word anyway. Go manage God's wealth. This is not about being rich. This is about God being rich and you being called to manage it well.
It's hard to follow that up. But if you're going to engage in the money of servants, here's a few rules for you, right? I think these are just 4 general principles that are good to consider before you take on debt, right? And the first is what Dave was just talking about, is to know the asset class that you're investing in, right? Know it intimately. There may come a time when you have more wealth than you can actively put out to the market yourself, and you do need to do some more passive stuff, but man, I would love if you're putting it somewhere that you understand to a pretty high degree. And for some people, that literally is just the S&P 500. It's a bet on the U.S. economy. It's been a good bet for the last 100 years, and I think that's fine if you're at that level, right? Another thing would be to work on yourself to the point where you have the knowledge that you're going to pull through the tough times, right? You'll figure it out. It's not a matter of if you're going to run into a wall. At some point, it's when, right? So building yourself to the point where you are confident you can get through it, I think it's critical before you take on any significant amount of debt or risk. And then the other piece would just be what we've talked about a bunch here, is controlling the downside, control the risk, figure out ways that you can maybe lose the capital you put into this deal, but it's not going to jeopardize everything else you've built, right? And then maybe the most important thing is make sure that it actually creates enough upside to be worth taking on, right? When you're starting out, oftentimes the upside is simply you can't buy the property otherwise, or the other thing would be you never actually need debt. If the deal is right and you have the character for it, there's going to be a partner out there that you could bring in, but debt is almost always going to be cheaper than that partner in a deal that works. I would, just think about that. If you're new, just getting into the business, you might want to think about how do those things apply there. Obviously, if you've used debt 1,000,000 times and it's worked for you, keep doing it. But I think those things are all good to consider.
One final question. This is something we do a lot, and I think it can be any favorite books from recent books that you've read.
Rich Dad, Poor Dad.
I did say that the only Ramsey book I read was just in the last month, and it is actually a really good book. Has nothing, of course, it has something to do with being in debt or not in debt, but it has more to do with your legacy. I think it's called The Legacy Countdown or something, and he just helps you put things in place as you begin evaluating these assets you've accumulated, and helps you with your mindset too. It really I have to say, reading it really caused me to double check some of my motives and some of my angles of doing things and realign them again. Great book.
Was that your final answer? Do you have any other ones?
That is a great book, honestly.
It
It was definitely a formative one for me. Another classic would be Darren Hardy's The Compound Effect, right? It's like that principle, just understanding that if you just do a little bit every day, it adds up to so much over time. And another piece of that would be, I think Dave Smooker was alluding to this when he talked about the building of it, and then later on in life, you figure out how to deploy it well, or what do you do with all this that you've built? A common theme that I've seen with anyone that's built wealth and is now on the back end of it is the building part was the fun part. So I think so much of this is just knowing what makes you tick and being aware that the building, a lot of the hard stuff is actually what you're going to look back at really fondly. This is the fun part. When you're in the weeds, you're in the thick of it. It sucks some days, but you're going to look back at it with fondness. It's a beautiful thing.
That's great. How about a big hand for these guys? it always happens. It goes way too fast once we get started. Just a couple closing comments. If you are not on our email list and you would like to be, there's a paper on the table in the back that tells you how you can get on our email list. And speaker for next month, shifting in a different direction again. Most of you won't know this name. A few of you probably will. But a good friend of mine by the name of Jim Smucker is traveling in from Ohio to speak next month. Most of the Smucker Corporation, Bird and Hand up there. Smucker Corporation, is that what it's called? Yeah, Bird and Hand Restaurant, all of that. So he's one of those brothers. He used to live in this area, moved out of the area a number of years ago. He is the one that started, or at least had a big part in starting the Bird and Hand Half Marathon, which I'm involved in on an annual basis now. It's a half marathon that is a fundraiser for the fire company that normally brings, it's a half marathon and a 5K, normally brings 2,000 to 3,000 people, usually the second weekend in September, and from 40 plus states and a couple of foreign countries usually. So it's a pretty fun event, and Jim Smucker is the one that started that with the business mindset because of a need that the fire company had. He is the CEO and president of Kime Company in Holmes County, Ohio, out in the Amish community. They have 650 employees, hardware, lumber distribution, manufacturing business. I think he does a good bit of speaking, and I haven't actually heard him speak publicly just a whole lot, but interesting fact about him, he's a runner, and he's not only a runner, but he's an ultra runner. So I think he was in his 50s when he started running, and he runs quite a bit of 100-mile races. And you might think, what does that have to do with business? And it actually has quite a lot to do with it. So he's on for next month. Really excited to have him come and share. It won't be so much specifically on real estate, but I would see it being a lot around business, probably some investing, and just life, and maybe what life can teach you from running a 100-mile race. Most of you didn't even know there was such a thing, but there is.
This is worth noting. Jim is 63 years old, and he's run a 100-miler a year for the last 9 years. What a guy.
Yeah, it's pretty impressive. It's a grueling event. So anyway, I believe that's it for tonight. We're going to wrap up. You guys already know this, but anytime we're in a group like this, there's some amazing people around you. So make some new connections, meet some new people, and we'll be back here again the first Wednesday evening in March.